Good evening, this is Lucky Lynx. This is number 2 in my series on how to communicate with spirits. It's coming up right after this.
When people attack you and your character or your looks or whatever it is, your response can inspire others. Fight over what the truth is.
Good evening, this is Lucky Lynx, coming to you from very sunny, very hot California today. This is video 2 in the series that I was promising on spirit communication. I need a visual for this one. For the second part, I would like to address a concept that I think people underestimate and don't even consider when it comes to spirit communication. And I need a visual for this one, so I'm using the tarot cards. Traditionally in the stories, when there was legends, fables, fairy tales, and other kinds of stories like that talked about or explained to us or reminisced about spirit communication, or when the spirit world would interact with humans, there were certain kinds of people that spirits would show up to communicate with. The fool, the individual who was innocent, the individual who had nothing to lose, the individual who was willing to take a risk, the individual who was brave enough to throw caution to the wind and leap without looking. Then we had the princess, the knight, the queen, and the king. Now, there was a reason why in all of those stories the spirits showed up to interact with these kinds of beings. It wasn't a mistake. It's not just children's fun. There was a reason why the spirits showed up for these kinds of beings. The princess represented hope, sensitivity, purity. The knight represented courage. The queen and also honor. The queen represented nurturing, abundance, and the king, the power to protect, and a whole new lineage and a whole new life. If you put all of these together, including the fool, you'll see that there was a reason why spirits would interact with them. For one thing, they would be generous. And the royalty and the fools in the old story ruled by and led by generosity. They embodied these certain principles that the spirit world was trying to balance humanity with. I'm not talking about the rulers of today, because we've obviously strayed very far from these concepts. But the spirit world interacted with these kinds of people, these kinds of characters, because, as I said, these particular qualities were really important for balancing humanity and for creating something that would help the world flourish. So now, before you go ahead and put yourself in one of these categories and say, well, that's why the spirit world loves me, because I fall into that category, I want you to ask yourself some very important questions. Because those stories, as I've said a million times, are lessons. They're lessons on how to behave. They're lessons on how to evolve spiritually. They're lessons on how to interact with the other worlds. Animal, spiritual, God, demigod, even hells. These particular beings who were most likely in the stories to encounter a spirit had some really interesting qualities that if you're going to claim, you better consider them. The fool, for example, Aladdin. We can even go with the Disney version of Aladdin. We don't have to go with the one that was in 1001 Arabian Nights, which is different from Disney. But let's go with the Disney version because most people are probably likely to have seen that one. He was a fool. He had nothing. He wanted great things from his life. He wanted romance. He wanted hope. He wanted prosperity. And he was enthusiastic. And he made a deal with the spirit world to get what he wanted. And in return, he promised from a generous and loving nature to free the genie. Now, then there was the king, Odysseus. He had an entire kingdom to take care of. He was loyal, he was brave, he made some mistakes along the way, but he never stopped trying to get back to his kingdom, even though the spirit world interfered with him. And the reason they interfered with him to begin with was because of his pride. So you see, each one of these particular characters that the spirit world would interact could have a positive aspect or a negative aspect. There were wicked queens, there were brash and arrogant knights, there were spoiled princesses, and when the spirit world came in contact with them, well, they usually made whatever individual it was pay. Now, there aren't a lot of stories about people in between, but think about it. The kingdom usually interacted with the spirit world because the kingdom itself had the ability to protect the people, to make the people flourish by ruling from generosity. So I've said that a few times, and maybe you can start to see here that generosity, the ability to rule from generosity, the ability to make a value for value exchange, to keep your word. These were things that the spirit world was very interested in. Why? Because they could benefit. If you knew a king, or you knew a queen, or you knew a royal, well, they probably had the power to protect a space that was very valuable to you where you lived. Now, not many people know this, and if you saw my last video on spirit communication, I talk about that big fat book that had to do with cataloging spirits. Go watch it if you haven't watched it. There are spirits that live in certain places that will actually create certain physical sicknesses in a human being if the human comes in without respect. There have been times when I've actually had a client and I've seen a particular malady that I've had, and I've said, well, have you been in the mountains, or have you been here, or have you been there? And they go, yeah, how did you know? Because the sickness is actually a result from that kind of spirit and from insulting that kind of spirit. Now, there are all sorts of stories about what happens when you insult a spirit, and usually those stories about the people in between, not the fool, not the royal, the ones who were in between, who just went along to get along, usually they were the ones who were arrogant enough or greedy enough to actually be entitled and expect more. A really good example is the three bears. The woman in the original story was not a little girl. She was an old woman, and she was entitled and angry, and she walked into the house of these bears, the natural world, and she demanded from it. It was an illustration of how we as humans just ravage and take from the natural world, and she was completely entitled. She walked in and she broke their stuff, took their stuff, and expected more, all because she wanted to please herself and her whims. That's a really good example of human beings interacting with the natural world, even though it was put in the case of a house and a bed and porridge and chairs. It still suggests that the magical interaction with the spirit world or the natural world, we take advantage, and what happens? We ruin their stuff. Now, think about all of this as you move forward and you ask yourself, how do you interact with the spirit world? Well, are you exhibiting the qualities of any one of these particular story characters, because those are the ones that they wish usually to interact with. And I will tell you, the spirit world doesn't see a lot of it, which is why it doesn't interact. Humans are not in the position to protect their spaces. We've let their spaces go. We have let the compact between the spirit world go down the toilet, because we've let their spaces that royalty held for a long time in protection, and we said, well, that's not important, so we destroy it. Any fool who comes up and says, hey, I'd like to bravely point out the error of what these people are doing, and they crucify him. Do you keep your agreements with yourself, with other people? Do you engage in value for value? If you go out and you take information, or you take this or you take that, do you give back? Do you give for what you get? Do you rule by generosity? The kings of old in the stories succeeded and interacted with the spirit world because they ruled by generosity. When they ruled by generosity, the whole kingdom flourished. Are you brave? Are you bold? Are you courageous? Or do you let the slightest discomfort make you turn around and stay with something that not only violates your values, but that actually makes a negative impact on the natural world? Do you face those problems in your life with boldness? Do you keep your agreements? Do you represent hope and protection? Do you give for what you get? Sometimes I look at this whole thing that calls itself a spiritual community, and I see nothing but people taking. And I'm not just talking about the New Age. I'm talking about all of the religions and all of the people who claim to be able to speak to spirits, whether it be the Holy Spirit or Shiva. There's a lot of greed. There's a lot of people who would destroy the natural spaces because it gets them something shiny. Do you spend all your time focusing on your appearance? Do you have, $2,000 in tattoos to make yourself appear a certain way? And then say, well, I can't really support these natural spaces. I can't really support the natural world, but I want the spirits to talk to me, and the spirits support me. How much time do you spend focused on you? Those of you who got a life path assessment for me, I showed you how the kingdom map works, and I showed you what the kingdom does, and I showed you what your place was in the kingdom in the center. That kingdom actually goes along with all of this. There are roles for each one of these story characters, these archetypes within it. And those who really knew what they were doing could protect the people, could protect the land, could keep their word, keep their vows, rule with honor, rule with bravery, rule with courage, and be foolish enough to stand up to something that threatened all that with faith and courage. These are the kinds of beings that the spirit world interacts with and traditionally interacted with. Ask yourself honestly, am I that kind of being? Only you can answer that question, but in the end, the spirit world will decide. I'm Lucky Lynx, as always, wishing you success and good fortune in all that you do. If you'd like to know more about these archetypes and how they fit together in the story of your life and how they fit together in relation to the spirit world, I am doing a beginning tarot class, which starts in July. People have already signed up for it, so if you'd like to get in on that, contact me, 779-302-8009, or conjurehope@gmail.com. Also, I have an intermediate to advanced tarot class that I'm teaching going on right now. You can get in on that one too. Or I've got a playing card class, how to read playing cards. I've got one in Mexican Loteria. I've got one in crystal ball reading. I've got two in how to read Lenormand. One's a basic and one's a grand tableau. I think that's all of them. Now, for those of you who want a reading, same thing, 779-302-8009. We can see where you are in relation to all of this. You can also email me at conjurehope@gmail.com. And for those of you who are getting something out of these videos and wish to lead by generosity and wish to give a value for value exchange for what you've gotten, I will include my PayPal and my Venmo below. Thank you to everyone who's already generously donated. You really have shown a great deal of generosity. So this is number 2 in this series. Tomorrow, I will film number 3, and we'll talk about another aspect of the spirit world.